They said it couldn't be done, but they underestimated the power of an iron will. Watch as we bring you the most intense stories of perseverance and the ultimate victory of the human spirit. Subscribe now and fuel your own fire with these cinematic tales.
I folded the last dish towel at 6:47 in the morning. I know because the clock on the microwave had been blinking 2 minutes fast ever since the power went out in October, and I'd never bothered to fix it. That's the kind of detail you remember when everything else is about to fall apart. The kind your mind holds on to because the rest is too much to carry all at once. My name is Vivienne. I am 63 years old. I taught high school English for 31 years, retired early to help my son through a rough patch, and then never quite went back to anything that looked like the life I'd planned. I own my home outright. I have a small pension, a modest investment account my late husband started before his heart gave out 12 years ago, and a vegetable garden in the backyard that my neighbors think is excessive. I say it's just practical. I am a practical woman. Or I thought I was, until the morning I found out my son had told his future mother-in-law that I was. And I'm using his exact words, the ones she repeated back to me with barely disguised satisfaction. A lot to handle. I'd raised that boy by myself from the time he was 11 years old. You want to know what I did when I found out? I'll tell you, but first you need to understand how we got there, because none of this started with a phone call. It started the way most betrayals do, slowly, with small things, the kind you explain away because you love someone. Darren met Gretchen at a work conference in Nashville. He was 34, she was 31. I remember the first time he brought her home for dinner. A Sunday in early spring, late March. The kind of day where the sun comes out but the wind reminds you it's not summer yet. She was pretty in the way that makes you feel like you should say so immediately, so I did. I told her she had lovely eyes. She said thank you and looked at her phone. I told myself that was nerves. Gretchen came from what her mother Sylvia called good family. I heard Sylvia use that phrase no fewer than 4 times during the first dinner we all shared together, at a restaurant Gretchen had chosen. Not the one Darren had suggested. Not the Italian place near my house he'd grown up going to on his birthday. But a new farm-to-table spot downtown, where the portions were decorative and the prices were not. Sylvia wore a cream blazer and pearls. She shook my hand like she was doing me a favor. Darren has told us so much about you, she said. Has he? I said. Not a question. A retired teacher. That's wonderful. Such a noble profession. I noticed the word retired landed like a lid being closed. I'm not someone who walks around looking for slights. Lord knows I've had enough real ones in my life that I don't need to manufacture imaginary ones. But there's a particular kind of woman, and Sylvia was this kind, who communicates entirely in tone. The words are always correct. The meaning underneath is something else entirely. Darren laughed too loud at everything Sylvia said that night. I watched my son, my child, the one I'd sat up with through fevers and nightmares, in the year after his father died when he barely spoke. I watched him perform for this woman like he'd been auditioning for her approval his whole life. On the drive home, I called my sister Paulette. Tell me I'm being paranoid, I said. Describe the blazer. I described the blazer. Paulette was quiet for a moment. You're not being paranoid. The engagement happened 9 months later. Darren called me on a Tuesday evening, which should have been my first clue. He was a Sunday caller, always had been ever since he moved out. Tuesday meant either very good news or very bad news, and he was using his very good news voice, so I sat down at the kitchen table with my cup of tea and I listened. He was happy. Genuinely, fully happy. The kind that comes through the phone like light under a door. And I was happy for him. I am his mother. I will always be happy for his happiness. I said, she's lucky to have you. And I meant it, and he said, Mom, I think she might be the one. And I said, then I'm glad you found each other. What I didn't say, I hope she knows what she has. What I didn't say, I hope she knows what she has. What I should have said, that too. 3 weeks after the engagement, Sylvia called me directly for the first time. She wanted to discuss the wedding. I found this slightly unusual. The planning hadn't formally started. No day had been set, but I was open to it. I made myself open to it. I made myself open to it. I had a notebook ready. I wrote down everything she said. She wanted a June wedding, 200 guests minimum. A venue with the right atmosphere. She mentioned a country club her family had been members of for 40 years. She mentioned a caterer. She mentioned a florist, whose name I recognized from a magazine my dentist kept in his waiting room. Then she mentioned the budget. Darren said you might be willing to contribute, she said, given that it's your son. Of course, I said. How much are we talking about? The number she said was not a suggestion. It was an expectation. It sat there on the line between us like something dropped from a height. I'll think about it, I said. Wonderful, she said, as if I'd already agreed. I did contribute. $40,000. I had it. My late husband had been meticulous about saving, and I'd been meticulous about not touching what we'd saved unless it mattered. A son's wedding mattered. I wired the money to the joint account Darren and Gretchen had opened for wedding expenses, and I did it without conditions, without a letter, without making it into anything other than what it was. A mother helping her child start his life. That was in September. By November, I noticed the calls getting shorter. By December, I noticed I wasn't being included in conversations I used to be included in. Venue updates I heard about secondhand through Darren, who mentioned them the way you mention weather. In passing, already over. The florist had been chosen. The caterer had been booked. The venue was confirmed. I asked Darren once carefully whether there was something I could weigh in on. He said, Mom, Gretchen and her mom have it under control. I said, I'm sure they do. I'm just asking if there's a role for me. He said, of course there's a role for you. You're my mom. That sentence was supposed to be reassuring. It wasn't. The seating conversation happened in February, about 4 months before the wedding. Gretchen's mother sent a document, a shared spreadsheet, color-coded with table numbers and guest categories. I was in a category labeled Extended Family Out-of-Town Guests. Table 11. In the spreadsheet, Table 1 was the head table, Table 2 was immediate family on the bride's side, Table 3 was immediate family on the groom's side. I was not at Table 3. I read that spreadsheet 3 times. Then I called Darren. Honey, I said. I used honey because I was trying to stay calm. I'm looking at the seating chart. Yeah, Gretchen put that together. She worked really hard on it. I'm at Table 11. Silence. With the out-of-town guests, I said, Mom, it's not a judgment. It's just how the tables worked out. Darren. I said his name the way I used to when he was 16 and trying to explain a bad grade. Your father's sister is at Table 3. I'm at Table 11. More silence. I'll talk to Gretchen, he said. He did not talk to Gretchen. Or if he did, nothing changed. I checked the document 2 weeks later, Table 11, same color code, same category. I closed my laptop and went out to the garden, and I pulled weeds for an hour even though it was February and there were hardly any weeds to pull. I want to be honest about what happened inside me during those weeks, because it wasn't just hurt. Hurt I could handle. I'd been handling hurt since I was a young woman. What I felt was something more specific, something that took me a while to name. It was erasure, not the dramatic kind. Not the kind where someone looks you in the eye and tells you don't matter. The slow kind. The kind where you are gradually edited out, like a first draft that keeps getting revised until none of the original language remains. I had raised this man. I had made his lunches and attended his games and sat in the dark outside his door the night he cried over his first heartbreak and didn't know I was there. I had written recommendation letters for his college applications and driven him to his first job interview and loaned him money when the economy went sideways in his 20s. I had done all of this without scorekeeping because that's what love is. You don't keep score. But I am still a person, and I was being treated like furniture. Nice furniture, maybe. Furniture you're glad you have when you need it. But furniture you arrange around the real life happening in the room. My sister Paulette came over on a Thursday night in late February with a bottle of wine and an attitude. That's the only way to describe it. She sat across from me at my kitchen table and she said, "Talk." So I talked. For 2 hours. I told her about the spreadsheet and the phone calls and the way Sylvia had started signing her text to the wedding group chat as Mob, Mother of the Bride, as if that title explained and justified everything. I told her about the florist I never got to meet, and the menu I found out about from Darren's cousin at Christmas. Paulette listened. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she refilled her glass and she said, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," I said. "Yes, you do," she said. "You've known for weeks. You're just waiting to be sure. She knows me too well. That's the problem, and the gift of a sister who's known you your whole life. The moment I became sure happened on a Wednesday afternoon in March. I was on my way out to run errands. I had my purse on my shoulder and my keys in my hand, and my phone rang. It was Darren. I answered because I always answer when it's my son. But he hadn't meant to call me. I could tell immediately. There was background noise, the particular hollow sound of a speakerphone conversation already in progress. I could hear Gretchen's voice and then, unmistakably, Sylvia's. I should have hung up. I know that. I've asked myself 100 times why I didn't just end the call the moment I realized. But I heard my name. Not Rivienne. They wouldn't use my name. I heard Darren's mother, said in Sylvia's voice, with a particular inflection that told me everything about what was coming next. Darren's mother means well, Sylvia was saying, but she has very strong opinions, and at a certain point we have to think about the atmosphere we're creating for the day. This is Gretchen's day. Gretchen said something I couldn't fully make out. Then Sylvia again. The table assignment is generous, honestly. She'll be comfortable there. She won't be hovering. A pause. Then Darren's voice low. She did put in a lot toward the budget. Sylvia. And we appreciate that, we all do. But contribution doesn't entitle someone to disrupt the vision. I stood in my hallway with my keys in my hand, and I listened to my son say nothing. That was the part that did it. Not Sylvia. I'd known about Sylvia for a long time. It was the silence from my son, the long, accommodating, cowardly silence of a man who had decided that keeping peace with his future wife's mother was worth more than the woman who had held his whole life together. I pressed the red button. I set my purse down. I sat on the stairs. I didn't cry. I thought about crying. Instead, I sat very still and I thought about what it means to fund something you've been excluded from, what it means to pay for your own erasure. Then I made some decisions. I didn't call Darren back. I didn't call Gretchen. I didn't text the group chat or send an email or do any of the things I might have done 6 months earlier, the things that would have made me feel briefly better and changed nothing. Instead, I called my attorney. Her name is not important, but she is good at her job and she has known me for 20 years, and when I explained the situation, she didn't offer sympathy first. She offered options. I appreciate that in a person. There were several things we could do. We talked through each one carefully, the way I used to walk through essay structure with my students. What's the argument? What's the evidence? What's the desired outcome? Then I called my bank. On a Thursday morning, 3 weeks before the wedding, I called Darren and asked him to come for coffee. I used the word coffee specifically. Not we need to talk. Not I need to see you. Just coffee, the way I'd invited him to coffee his whole adult life. And he came. He looked tired. He'd been losing weight in the way stressed people lose weight. Not healthy, just the hollow-cheeked kind. I made coffee and I put out the good cups, the ones his father had brought back from a trip to Portugal the year before Darren was born. And I sat across from him and I let him tell me about the final dress fitting and the caterer's tasting menu and the timeline for the rehearsal dinner. I listened to all of it. Then I said, I need to talk to you about something and I want you to listen the way I just listened to you. He put his cup down. I told him what I'd heard on that accidental call. I said it plainly, without drama, the way you state facts. Sylvia's words. The seating chart. Contribution doesn't entitle someone to disrupt the vision. The word hovering. I said it all and then I stopped and I let the silence sit. Darren turned a color I hadn't seen on him since he was a teenager trying to explain himself. He started with, I didn't know and moved through she doesn't mean it like that, and arrived eventually after several minutes at something close to an apology that was also still, somehow, a defense of Gretchen. I said, I'm not asking you to choose sides. He looked relieved. I'm asking you to see clearly, I said. That's different. He said he heard me. He said things would be better. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine. And I looked in my son's hand. The same hand I'd held on the first day of kindergarten. Same hand I'd bandaged after he fell off his bike at age 9. And I said, I love you. Nothing changes that. I did not tell him about the phone call I'd made to the bank. I did not tell him about the letter I'd asked my attorney to prepare. Not yet. 7 days before the wedding, I sent a certified letter to the address on the wedding account. In that letter, I formally requested the return of my $40,000 contribution, citing a specific clause my attorney had helpfully drafted, a clause she told me was enforceable because the money had been documented as a conditional gift with specific terms around the contributing party's role and participation in the event. Had those terms been in writing from the beginning? No. We had not been that formal, but we had been in communications, texts, emails, a voicemail, in which my involvement had been explicitly referenced as part of why I was contributing. That, my attorney explained, created a record. I also included a second document. Darren had mentioned, months ago, that Gretchen's family wanted him to sign a prenuptial agreement. Standard practice, her father Marlowe had said, just protecting assets, and that he'd agreed without much discussion. He told me this casually, the way he mentioned you've rescheduled a dentist appointment. What Darren didn't know was that I quietly looked into what Marlowe's assets actually were, and what a standard prenuptial agreement in the state meant for a spouse who came in with significantly less than the other party. What I'd found concerned me enough to include a note with the letter. A note suggesting, gently, factually, that Darren might want to have his own attorney review the agreement before the ceremony. I sent the letter on a Monday. By Wednesday, I had heard nothing from Gretchen. By Thursday, I had heard from Darren. He did not call. He drove to my house. He arrived at 8 in the morning and knocked instead of using the key I'd given him years ago, which told me everything about his state of mind. I let him in. I made coffee. I sat across the table from my son, and I waited. He was furious. That's the honest word. Not hurt. Furious, the way people get when something they buried very carefully gets unearthed. He said the letter was manipulative. He said I was trying to control the wedding. He said Gretchen was devastated, Sylvia was livid, and that I had embarrassed him in front of his future family. I let him say all of it. Then I said, "Are you done?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Then I have a question. When you heard Sylvia say that my contribution didn't entitle me to disrupt the vision, did you tell her that the woman she was talking about had just written a check for $40,000? Did you say anything at all?" His jaw moved. "Or did you sit there?" I said, quietly, and let her say it. The kitchen was very still. Outside, a bird was doing something complicated in the oak tree. I heard it clearly because everything else had gone so quiet. Darren put his face in his hands. Not in anger, in the other thing. The thing that looks like anger from the outside until it breaks open. When he looked up, his eyes were red. He said, "I didn't know what to say." "I know," I said. I kept thinking if I made it work with both sides, you were trying to make everyone happy, I said. "I understand that. But you can't make everyone happy by making one person invisible, and that person was me." He cried. My 63-year-old self sat across the table from my 36-year-old son and watched him cry, and I felt something that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, but something in the exact middle, the particular ache of a thing becoming true that you'd hoped would stay theoretical. I handed him a napkin. That's a mother's reflex. It never goes away. The wedding did not happen on the scheduled date. This was not entirely my doing. The letter had prompted Darren to do what I'd suggested, have his own attorney review the prenuptial agreement. And what that attorney found was, I'm told, significant enough that Darren had asked for a postponement. Gretchen agreed to a postponement. Sylvia, according to Paulette, who heard from a neighbor, did not take this gracefully. I don't know all the details. I wasn't consulted. That was appropriate. These were decisions between Darren and Gretchen, and whatever they work out or don't work out is between them. What I know is what happened in my kitchen 2 weeks after the wedding date that wasn't. Darren came again. No knock this time. He used his key. He stood in my kitchen doorway while I was making breakfast, and he said, "Mom." I turned around. "I need you to know," he said, "that I heard you. About being invisible. I need you to know that I've been thinking about it every day." I turned the stove down. I looked at my son. "Gretchen and I are working some things out," he said. "I don't know where we're going to land, but I know that whatever happened, I should have stood up for you. At the table assignment. At that phone call, every time Sylvia made one of her comments, and I just let it go. I should have said something. I should have said a lot of things. I said, yes, you should have. I'm sorry. I crossed the kitchen and I held my son. He's taller than me now. Has been since he was 15, and when I hugged him, he bent down the way he does and put his head on my shoulder like a child. I let him. I kept my arm around him, and I said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. There is a version of the story where I tell you what happened to Gretchen, what happened to Sylvia, whether the wedding eventually took place or whether Darren came to his senses, or whether Gretchen came to hers. I don't have a clean ending for you. Life is not a spreadsheet. You don't get color-coded resolutions. What I have is my kitchen, and my son, and a table where 2 cups of coffee sat going cold while we talked until noon. What I have is $40,000 returned to my account in early May, which I put into a fund I've labeled with my granddaughter's name. A granddaughter I don't have yet, but intend to spoil thoroughly when she arrives. What I have is the knowledge that I did not go quietly. I am 63 years old. I have buried a husband and taught 1,000 students and grown more tomatoes than any one woman needs. I have been patient, and I have been practical, and I have given generously and asked for very little in return. But there is one thing I will not do. I will not fund my own erasure. And if you are sitting somewhere reading this or listening or watching, and someone in your life is asking you to do exactly that, to pay for something you've already been excluded from, to smile and sit at table 11 and pretend that's enough, I want you to hear me clearly. You don't have to. You can love someone completely and still require them to see you. You can want a relationship with your child and still refuse to subsidize your own disappearance. You can be soft in all the places that matter and still be immovable in the one place that matters most, the place where your dignity lives. I know that now more completely than I knew it before. I learned it the hard way at a kitchen table over coffee that went cold. But I learned it, and some lessons are worth exactly what they cost. I've had a long time to think about what actually happened in that kitchen, not just what was said or what I did, but why any of it unfolded the way it did. Here's what I've come to believe. The way people treat you is rarely random. It follows a logic. Sylvia didn't decide overnight that I could be dismissed. She decided it because every time she tested that boundary, the tone at dinner, the seating chart, the word hovering, nothing pushed back. Darren's silence wasn't cruelty. It was a habit he'd built one small surrender at a time. And habits don't break themselves. They break when the cost of keeping them becomes undeniable. That's the part I had to sit with honestly, because I played a role in it too, not in being treated poorly. That was their doing, not mine, but in how long I waited, how many small things I explained away, how many times I chose to believe the generous interpretation when the evidence was pointing somewhere else. I called it patience. Some of it was. Some of it was fear, the fear that if I named what was happening, I'd have to do something about it, and doing something about it might cost me my son. That fear is real. I'm not going to tell you it isn't, but I've learned that the cost of acting on it, of staying quiet to keep the peace, is higher than it looks at first. You don't just lose the argument. You lose, inch by inch, the version of yourself that knows she matters. And once that's gone, getting it back is hard work. What I did wasn't revenge. I want to be clear about that. Requesting the return of my $40,000 wasn't punishment. It was consequence. Honest, proportional, following naturally from what had occurred. I had given money to participate in something. I had been excluded from that something. The logic was simple, even when the feelings weren't. And the note about the prenuptial agreement, that wasn't meddling. That was a mother seeing something her son had been too distracted or too hopeful to look at clearly. You can love someone and still tell them what you see. In fact, that's often exactly what love requires. Darren and I talk every Sunday now. He's still working things out with Gretchen. I don't know how that story ends, and it's not mine to tell. What I know is that my son looked at me across a kitchen table and said I should have stood up for you, and I believed him, not because it fixed everything, because he meant it. Intelligence isn't just about knowing things. It's about being willing to look at the evidence even when it's uncomfortable, even when looking away would be easier. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act right after the fear has said everything it has to say. And integrity is what you're left with when you've done both of those things and the dust settles. I'm 63. I learned all 3 of those things later than I would have liked. But I learned them at my own kitchen table with the good cups out and the coffee going cold, and that's as real a classroom as any I ever taught in. Table 11. That's where they put me. I've never sat at a table that taught me more.